All right, let's jump right into this explainer put together specifically for you, the preaching students of the Expositors Academy. We're kicking off our series on intertextuality with one of the absolute most foundational, hotly debated, and honestly, completely fascinating topics you are ever going to face in your study: how exactly the New Testament uses the Old Testament. And listen, this is not just some dry academic exercise. This dictates the very lifeblood of how we read and understand the Bible.
To really get our minds around the stakes here, imagine you're grabbing a burger. You go to take a bite, and you notice the bottom bun is made of a dark rye dough, but the top bun is a completely different white wheat dough. It's weird, right? They just don't match. The two buns are supposed to hold the entire meal together perfectly. As expositors, we have to stop and ask ourselves, why would we ever accept a theological framework that does the exact same thing?
That burger actually perfectly illustrates a massive theological reality. If you're striving to be a consistent theologian, your foundational hermeneutics at the bottom, how you interpret the text, must perfectly match and hold together your end times eschatology at the top. Even though they might feel like they're on totally opposite ends of the doctrinal spectrum, they are completely inseparably connected. Change the bottom bun, and you literally change the top bun.
So here's our roadmap for the explainer today. 1. The theological burger bun. 2. Ground rules for debate. 3. Evaluating theological arguments. 4. The single meaning debate. And 5. Contextual conundrums. Kicking things off with Section 1, the theological burger bun, where we connect interpretation directly to our future hope. Moving right along to Section 2, ground rules for debate. Important but not primary. Look, as you prepare to preach and teach, you got to remember that while this debate touches everything from the nature of the church to our relationship with the Old Testament law, it absolutely must be carried out with a charitable spirit. We don't ever need to question anyone's Christian maturity or intelligence over this stuff. Just look at the legendary friendship between R.C. Sproul and John MacArthur. They held very different views on these exact issues, different hermeneutics, different eschatologies entirely, but they maintained immense respect and care for one another as faithful brothers. We can push back on ideas, for sure, but always with humility. Because before we even touch eschatology, we have to realize this is fundamentally a debate about bibliology and hermeneutics. Trying to debate the meaning of end times texts with someone who holds entirely different hermeneutical presuppositions, that is literally like trying to play a game of chess when you don't even agree on how the pieces move. It generates a ton of heat, but absolutely no light. You're just going to talk right past each other.
Which brings us to Section 3, evaluating theological arguments. Let's look at some biblical principles for the exegete.
If we want to avoid just shouting past each other in the study, we need a rigorous biblical framework for evaluating these different positions. First up, actually take the time to truly understand a position. Don't be lazy and create a theological straw man or caricature of someone's view. Proverbs 18:13 hits the nail on the head here. Answering before hearing is folly and shame. Second, you've got to plunder the strong man's house. What I mean by that is, you need to wrestle with the absolute strongest arguments of opposing views, not just pick off the weakest ones. Think about it. If your theology only holds up against your opponent's weakest points, it's not exactly robust, is it? Third, you need to consider as many different views as possible to make sure your exegetical work is truly comprehensive. As Proverbs 18:17 reminds us, the first guy to state his case always sounds perfectly right, until someone else comes along and cross-examines him. And finally, you have to evaluate arguments strictly by the weight of their exegetical force, not by the majority view, not by how old the tradition is, and definitely not by academic respectability or expert opinion. Let God be true and every man a liar. All right, on to Section 4, the single meaning debate, one authorial intent versus multiple meanings. This brings us to the absolute core conflict when it comes to interpreting prophecy. Does a biblical text have more than one meaning? Let's define this single meaning approach. It argues for one and only one authorial intent. Now, the timeless truths might be applied in hundreds of different ways across different cultures, but there is only one meaning. This is the bedrock of literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutics. I mean, think about it. If a speaker says one thing right now and then later tries to inject a completely different meaning into those exact words, communication just entirely breaks down. But here's where it gets incredibly tricky. Despite that basic logic of communication, huge numbers of conservative believers actually lean toward multiple meanings in two very specific situations. First, when New Testament writers seem to take an Old Testament passage entirely out of its original context. And second, when Old Testament promises haven't been literally fulfilled yet.
And that sets us up perfectly for our final section, Section 5, Contextual Conundrums. We're looking at problem passages in the New Testament.
Let's see how this creates a massive exegetical mystery. In his book, The New and the Old, Michael Vlack points out 14 specific passages across Matthew, Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians, where the New Testament quotation of the Old Testament just doesn't seem to match the original context at all. This isn't just a weird one-off issue. It's a widespread structural hurdle for every single expositor.
Consider this massive textual collision. Hosea 11:1 is very clearly talking about the historical nation of Israel. It's not about the Messiah, and honestly, it isn't even a prophecy. But then you turn to Matthew 2:15, and Matthew flat out claims that Jesus' family fleeing to Egypt actually fulfills that exact verse. I mean, how can that possibly be?
We see the exact same tension in Acts 2. Peter quotes Joel's prophecy, which talks about these insane, cosmic, end-of-the-world signs, like the sun turning to darkness and the moon turning to blood, to explain what is happening right then on the day of Pentecost. But obviously, the moon didn't literally turn to blood that day. So this leads a lot of folks to suggest that the biblical authors are just using texts non-contextually, adding whole new meanings that simply weren't there before.
And you can see how this spills over into a much bigger debate. What do we do with unfulfilled literal promises made to Israel, like the massive land promises? Are these promises taking on multiple meanings now, being fulfilled figuratively or spiritually within the church today?
So here's the crucial question we're left wrestling with. If allowing later writers to redefine earlier revelation undermines the basic rules of hermeneutics and the very nature of communication itself, then how on earth do we solve the mystery of Matthew 2? Did Matthew just break the rules of exegetical chess? And ultimately, what does this framework mean for the authority and accuracy of your pulpit? That's what we have to figure out.